Judah, thank you for joining us. You are the star, the creator, all of it for your show. I just lost the name of your show in my mind. I'm sorry.
It's now or never.
It's now or never, and I couldn't remember that it's now or never. How about that?
Right.
Sorry about that. Judah, let's talk about your show a little bit because it's a one-person show, and you tell some very interesting stories about kind of your life as a 60-year-old. You kind of repeat, that's kind of your mantra through the whole thing is you're Judah, you're 60, and you're a writer. So tell us a little bit about the show itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of doing like this kind of one person show is something I dreamed about when I was younger, when I was maybe your age, say in my 30s. And but I didn't really have the chutzpah to do it. And maybe I needed a little more life experience. And then around 50, or in my 50s, I wrote a show called My Life in the Middle Ages, which was kind of around, getting to midlife. And boy, I'd never pictured myself, as this like older, old white guy. So then I think around turning 60, yeah, some of the issues, things had changed, and what does it mean? But I think the idea of it's now or never for me is really about, I feel like I've reinvented myself several times over the course of my life. And that's one of the things about getting older. We accumulate this weird set of skills and life experiences. And so I was like, okay, it's now or never in terms of if I want to do performance, if I want to get my writing out, and what does it mean to be, in late middle age. So the subtitle of the show is My Life in the Late Middle Ages. So, what does that mean? And, I'm hoping that kind of the takeaway from the show, there's some stuff in there. I'd say it's, there's a lot of humor. There's some more poignant stuff, because I also think that getting older, you lose things. That's one of the things I've learned is that I've lost people. My body, even though I'm in fairly good shape, has lost the ability to do some things I used to do, or at least I have to modify them. There's just these losses that come with getting older, but I feel like there's also opportunity to do, instead of just being like, well, gee, I wish I had tried this or tried that. Now I feel more of a sense, I guess, of time urgency to say, well, okay, if performance or going on the road is something I really want to do, I need to like shit or get off the pot. I need to move. I need to do it while I can. So I think for me, that's a takeaway, is kind of like, if you have a dream, if there's something you really want to do it. And at the same time, the refrain in the show about, yeah, I'm 60, I'm Judah, and I'm Judah, I'm 60, I'm a writer. It's also kind of dealing with that inner critic. I have a very active inner critic. And he has lots of opinions, and they're not usually very helpful. So by kind of externalizing him almost into another character, it's a way for me to kind of, find the humor in that, and also kind of cut him down to size and say, okay, well, thank you for sharing, but I'm doing this anyway. So that's kind of the idea, I think, of the show.
I think it's a great concept for the show because it is both very personal and human towards you, but also very easy to connect with. Talking about that inner critic, you actually have a moment in the show, and I'm not going to spoil what's going on during that moment, but where your inner critic has a conversation with a real external critic,
Right.
of something you've created, and I think that is one of my favorite moments in the piece because they build off of each other, and it's something that I think artists can really relate to because we have those conversations in our head all the time.
Right. I mean, I also, my kind of day job or part-time day job is that I teach nonfiction writing, personal writing. And basically, I'm teaching a class now, actually 2 classes, for people who are thinking about writing memoirs. And we workshop some of their material, and it can be really hard, and understand this, for people to hear, if we're talking about their writing, but this is their life experience on the page. And that's the thing about doing, I think doing performance, and especially performance, if it's directly from one's life, it's like, I feel like I'm making myself pretty vulnerable up there, and so then if, people don't come to the show, or in the case of the situation you're talking about, where somebody came and they were uh, and they were not happy because, without giving too much away, but yeah, they were expecting one thing and they got another. Um, that almost, yeah, it can be almost like, oh my God. So, uh, it can be difficult to receive. I mean, in the case of that individual, he was kind of so out there that I could pretty quickly see the humor in the situation. But yeah, it's like it's a very, I feel like I'm pretty vulnerable when I'm up there, and I think like you said, any artist who's putting his or her work out is making themselves vulnerable in some way, and everybody has an opinion, so
Hmm.
it's challenging. It's challenging.
I like that you mentioned that you teach nonfiction writing, because I think what makes your show unique to me is, um, Fringes are known for having the one person storyteller show. It's like a signature thing, but a lot of those storytellers come from a background of stand up or some sort of other performance, and you can really tell with yours that there's a writerly influence to it, because there's a pacing and phrasing, and I can tell you've kind of really thought about the words you're using and how you're using them. Can you maybe expand a little bit on how you compose your show?
Yeah, I think I appreciate that observation, because because I kind of first was a writer. It's very The language is very important to me, and a number of people have commented to me that going to the show, they feel like there's a rhythm in terms of the language, and I've been told that a lot, that the way that I speak and the way that I tell these stories, there is this kind of rhythmic um, flow that goes through the show. And people commented about that in my first show as well. And I think that comes from the writing and the voice that I developed. I've been writing professionally. I really didn't come to that until I was in my early 40s, but at this point, it's been, over 20 years. And yeah, I put a lot of thought into the writing, and it's interesting. Some of the pieces, maybe I sat down and tried to write an experience. There's a few things in the show that are a little more like spoken word, and those just kind of came more organically. I have a piece about I'm talking about going to the Mass Eye and Ear Infirmary, which is basically a clinic slash hospital, because I am hard of hearing, and and then it was like, so I'm telling a fairly linear story, and then I go into another way of telling the story where it's more like spoken word, and I use so one of my past lives, I taught deaf kids and I was a sign language interpreter, and so I incorporate some elements of American Sign Language when I'm doing the spoken word. I'm not really doing a word for sign translation, but it's more of a poetic thing where I'm using some signs that I feel kind of get to give the audience a feeling for what it's like. Um, and one of the things I think I was going to be able to do in Calgary, I talked with the director there, was this summer to have at least one of my shows interpreted, because I do incorporate some ASL elements, and there's a number of things in the show about dealing with hearing loss and deafness, and I would love to have it be accessible for a deaf audience. So I think they were going to get an interpreter for me, one or two interpreters. Unfortunately, the festival didn't happen, but I'm hoping to go next year, and I'm going to
Mhm.
try to do that. And yeah, there's a I guess I think one of the things is also related to the rhythm is and some of this is maybe because I used to sign a lot, I don't now, and some of it may be my background. I'm Jewish. I tend to use my hands a lot and my body a lot, and that also, I think, contributes to that feeling of rhythm in the show, movement. One of the things about American Sign Language is it's like because it's a visual language, things are set up in space. So, if I were talking about my uncle, I might say something like, and then once you establish that my uncle's over there, then, in that conversation, he's kind of there. And so one of the things I did was when I was working on my first show and also on this show, I worked with a director who is an actor who also has done a one woman show. And a lot of what she helped me with was taking it off the page and setting things up in space. And I felt like one thing that helped me was in understanding that was the fact that ASL it's very spatial. You use space in a conscious way, and that seemed to help me a lot when I thought about, okay, well, so my inner critic is here, and anytime I'm saying I'm Judah, I'm 60, and I'm like inside, I'm going to be upstage center, kind of setting things up in a way so the audience would have a feeling like, okay, so here he is telling us a story. He's downstage, kind of center. Here he is in his own head. He's upstage, using lighting and staging in order to kind of tell the story. I really, yeah, it's like, because that was a kind of an edge for me, being somebody who was a writer and was thinking about how to, taking up more space. That was a bit of an edge for me. Like, okay, you're on stage, you gotta like use the space,
Right. And I think you do use that very well. One of the things that I noticed was the two chairs and how they were placed, apart from each other. And I'm like, it's one person show. Why are there two chairs? And then like there was a moment where you're going back and forth with yourself, and the chairs were super effective for that. And so it was a really nice thing where you've definitely blocked this out and created, conscious decisions about where you are when you're saying certain things or doing certain things, to the point where you even have your little nightstand of accoutrement that you have to use in the evening, that we won't get too into because I don't want to ruin it. But that is super effective. And as soon as you start like using those things, it just gets a great reaction from the audience.
Well, that's one of the things I think I've also learned from Fringe, from doing a number of Fringe festivals and also other shows just in the community. How I've seen some really talented performers who were really compelling, and sometimes they had almost no props at all. And that's where it came back to me to the personality of the storyteller or the actor and the way they're kind of creating something with their words and their body. There's one storyteller in particular I've seen, Martin Dockery, who's been on the Fringe circuit, and he's so energetic, and the way he uses his voice and his body, and sometimes he has literally like maybe a book for a prop or one or two things or a stool, and it totally didn't matter or works well because he's creating this world, and the audience, everybody just follows him. So my first show I had more props, but I learned simplify, and then using those simple things like say two chairs and where on stage I should set things up. A lot of that came from, again, working with an experienced actor, and who where we would discuss these things, but she gave me a lot of ideas that I could kind of riff off of. And then I found that once I had a sense of that, it made me more confident and more comfortable, because then I know, okay, this part of the show I'm on downstage left, and then I'm going to be going over there, and they become like touchstones that help me remember the show. It's like a way of getting it in the body. Because that was a challenge initially, was when the show was new a couple of years ago, just memorizing the whole thing, because that's one thing about being a one-person show. It's like you're it, and you gotta like hold a lot in the head, and that was definitely a stretch for me. It took me quite a while to really memorize the whole thing and get it in my body.
I'm sure. I mean, as someone who does multi-person shows versus one-person shows. It's hard for me to memorize sometimes what I have, let alone the entire thing. And so I totally get that. And I think that's an interesting point talking about having touchstones because for people that don't know, like sometimes when you're on stage, it doesn't matter how well you know your show, you get lost. And having those points where you can kind of regroup and find yourself again are super important, especially in a show that can stretch up to an hour long or an hour plus, and find that. So that's a really good point that you make about that. And you do talk a lot about kind of the crafting of your show within it, and I think that's a really cool thing. And you tell a couple of very interesting stories of your experience doing your show. And I don't want to get into too much detail, but you've been to quite a few Fringe festivals. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly. I'm trying to remember how I stumbled on. I think I first heard about Fringe festivals around 2014, 2015, and the first one that I went to was in Rochester, New York. And I didn't really understand really how the whole thing worked. In Rochester, you have to find a venue that will host you, so it's somewhat more the logistics a little more complicated, and I didn't really understand that that most people will come and do a series of shows. So I ended up going to Rochester basically to do one performance, and I was in kind of an out of the way place, and I ended up I think with about 20, I think I had about 25 people because I ended up hitting one of the parks and there was like somebody rappelling down a building or something. And as part of the opening of their festival, I mean, it was crazy. So I was giving out cards and some of those people came. Um, but yeah, I realized there was this whole circuit. And um, so then I ended up doing the Minnesota Fringe in 2016, which was a little crazy because I ended up driving halfway across the country. But I stopped in my hometown of Cleveland, and I actually spent one night in Elgin. I never heard of Elgin until that night when I just happened to stop because it was like, on the way up to Minneapolis. Um, but then subsequently, I did my newer show, this show in Winnipeg and Regina in 2018, and then last year in Calgary and Edmonton. And I've also done the show a number of times in Boston and a few other places. So I've gotten a chance to see, every Fringe is a little different, or sometimes actually very different. It was interesting because Calgary and Edmonton are both comparable size, quite, 1.5 million, very spread out cities. But Calgary's festival is very small. It's essentially a neighborhood festival, and a lot of people in the city didn't even know it was happening. On the other hand, it was more laid back, friendly, and I was one of about 26 shows. Whereas in Edmonton, everybody knew it was going on. It's huge, but I was one of 254 shows, and getting people to come. I ended up drawing about the same number in Calgary and in Edmonton because in Edmonton used to be that everybody got a review from like a local paper, but one of those papers, an alternative, went out of business. So last summer was the first time that there were a fair number of shows that didn't get reviewed, and including mine. And even if you got a bad review, I was told in the past, people would show up. But it really hurt those of us who didn't get any media at all. And so, I was out handing out postcards. And of course, most people doing this are not 60 plus years old because it's exhausting. And, so I was averaging probably, 25, 30 people per performance, which was enough to feel like I had an audience, but not really enough to make any money, given all the expenses that I had. And it was just, it's a very kind of exhausting thing with all the logistics and going back and forth from my venue, from my billet, and doing everything you have to do in a 2-week period. If I figured out my hourly rate, I probably earned 10 cents an hour if I was lucky. I'm glad I had the experience, but I wasn't planning to go back to Edmonton. I just found it was maybe a little too overwhelming. And Winnipeg, is not as big as Edmonton, but they had like 180 shows. So it kind of had a similar experience there. It was just hard to get on people's radar. Where this, you know, the mid-size or smaller festivals for me are, you know, just more laid back and a little more user friendly. When I was in Elgin, I was there, I think 3 years ago for the festival. I had a great billet that was like right on, like right along, practically around the river. It was in like an old like warehouse that had been turned into like a big condo. So I was in this very cool, it was above a law office, and it was this really cool space.
Hmm.
And I could walk, you know, to my venue, you know, and I did, I think 3 shows, and I probably averaged like 10 to 15 people per show. So it wasn't like I was getting big crowds, but it was fun, and it was, yeah, quite laid back, very friendly. And yeah, it was fun. And maybe a little easier for me as a little bit older person than, you know, trying to deal with, say, Edmonton, where I was just kind of lost in the crowd.
That's interesting. I mean, like, and I appreciate the fact that you enjoyed being here so much that you were planning on coming out this year, until, you know, we had to
But
change the deal. But that's really interesting. And your show, the one that is in this festival, is a recording of a previously done show. Was that during a Fringe festival, or was that just a separate show? Or
yeah, that was actually one of the shows I did in Winnipeg.
okay,
So it's interesting because that, you know, audiences, I've also learned, like when I was in Minnesota, um, I had some audiences that were very quiet, and there's, I think, a lot of humor in my show, but audiences will, you know, every audience will react differently. So sometimes they'll laugh at a particular line, and sometimes you could hear there's nothing, no reaction, or no audio, nothing I can hear. But then, like in Minnesota, a few times I had very quiet audience, and then people come up to me and they said, "Oh, it was so funny," or "I really liked it," or whatever, whatever. So, you know, it can vary. So the audience in the video, um, I mean, there's some laughter, but they were a fairly quiet audience. Whereas the day before, I had the same number of people. I was around 35 people in this theater, and they were like raucous. They were laughing. They were, you know, very, very giving me a lot back. These guys were much quieter. But it was a live performance at the Winnipeg Fringe in a very nice theater there. I had a really nice venue, which was kind of centrally located, and yeah, so it was a great space, and I had a very good tech and lighting and everything like that. So it was cool to do it in front of a live audience.
it's really interesting because that specific video, I mean, your performance is solid, and yeah, the audience is a little bit quiet, but you can tell they're into it. And then you have this one moment, which, I mean, normally I'd be like, well, I don't know if I'd use this video, but it worked for some reason. Where the audience, members of the audience, do like the worst thing you can do to a performer, and you just take a moment. You know, you stop, you take a moment, take it in, let the disruption end, and then just get right back into it. And it's something that I appreciated that you left in and that you used, because it's something that, like I said, it's something performers are like, if that happens, how do you handle that? And you
Right.
did it so well.
Yeah, I've had a variety of things happen in performances. As one of the pieces in my show was about, you know, and I really appreciate tech people and lighting people, and it can be a thankless job. But in this case, I kind of had a bit of a tech from hell. And so there's a story about it. And actually, that was the story where I was telling my director about it. And she said, "That's hysterical. You got to write this." So
Mm.
after I told her, I ended up writing it up. But I said to her, you know, it wasn't funny at the time. She said, "Oh, I know, but it's very funny now."
Mhm.
So, but what happened in that, you know, honestly, if I were more tech savvy, I would have probably edited that little thing out, because I did stop. Um, and I found out right after the show, one of the usher told me what happened was this one woman got sick, and
Mm.
she needed to leave, and her two friends didn't want her to go alone. course, this was in the show. I didn't know that. I thought they were
Right.
offended by something, but so it was nice that they let me know, yeah, that she was sick. And once you're in there, and if you're not feeling well, yeah, there was no other way out. But all I knew was here I am, and all of a sudden, these people coming down and walking by me. So that was a little discombobulating, but. Yeah, but it was not. It was nice that I found out afterward, that it was not like we hated your show, so we walked out. Of course, that can happen, but
Sure.
yeah, it was what it was. It would have been better, I guess, if that wasn't in the video. But
I don't know if I agree with you. I think it was good that it was in the video because it worked. Like, it was a moment of just humanity where, you just had to take in what was happening and then regroup and go. And I think that worked. And it kind of fit in with the theme of the show you know, uh, kind of rolling with the punches at times, talking about your tech issues with a different show and stuff like that. I think it kind of just rolled into that. And I think that's why I liked the fact that it was still in there.
yeah, well, it is true that I would say, there's a couple threads in the show. One is about kind of dealing with getting older and the things that go along with it. One is kind of the struggle to like be a writer or a storyteller or live a creative life. And then there's number three, which is kind of like, yeah, mishaps on the road, and man plans and God laughs. So there are, yeah, several stories in the show about stuff that happened, that I hadn't planned on while I'm trying to, do this show, or the first show. And so in some ways it's true that just is like, okay, another time when, this is not what I had ordered from the catalog, and stuff happens. So
Yeah.
that's true. But that was definitely not scripted, you know.
Oh no, you can tell it's not scripted, but it is. It's like the story continues as we
Yeah.
go. That's really cool. You mentioned earlier, and we didn't really talk about it, that you studied to work with the deaf, and then you talked about hearing loss. And was that something that you already had at the time, or is that just kind of some sort of like weird otherworldly irony that all of a sudden you start to have hearing loss years later?
Yeah, it's the latter. I so I actually I have I have to like be careful, like when I go to Fringe, to because I have a book, a memoir that came out last fall called Echoes of Jerry, and the subtitle is One Man's Search for His Deaf Uncle and His Own Voice. So basically what happened was, growing up, I have a very small family, and my only uncle was deaf. He had been born deaf, and he had been educated orally, so he did speak. But if you weren't used to deaf speech, you would probably have a hard time understanding him. I didn't see him that often, but I just felt this connection with him from the time I was a little kid. And I think it was because I'm gay. I grew up, for various reasons, always feeling kind of different, as an outsider. And he was obviously different and an outsider, and not always treated very well in the family. And so I felt this connection with him, even though I didn't get a chance to spend a lot of time with him. He ended up passing away suddenly when he was only 44 from a heart attack, and I was 18. It was just before I graduated from high school. By the time he died, I had decided I wanted to go to college and study to teach deaf kids. And I wanted to learn sign language, which he had been basically denied, because at that point it was like oralism was supposed to be the way to go. And my uncle was totally deaf, so his speech was not normal. He had a lip read, which is very difficult, and his life was definitely limited by the fact that he was really never accepted for being a whole person. So I ended up writing a memoir about him and me and my experiences in the deaf community, and also about coming out in my late 20s and beyond, because I feel that there's actually a lot of parallels between being deaf and being gay. The main one is that, unlike any other group, if you're deaf, if you're gay, you have to find your community outside of your family and the people around you. It's a profound sense of otherness that I don't think people really realize. But when I work with deaf people, especially in my late 30s and early 40s, when I did it for a second time after burning out the first time, I found there's all these gay people who work with deaf people. And it made sense for me based on my own experience with my uncle and my own experience of otherness, that there was this like affinity, so that like in Boston, in the interpreting community, like I'd say half the women are probably lesbians. And of the men, there are very few men who work as interpreters here, but most of the ones who do are gay. And I think it's, again, because of that sense of understanding what it's like to be outside, and having to find your people. It's really profound. So I always felt a sense of connection with my uncle. He died. I ended up going to Northwestern and studying deaf education. I didn't finish at Northwestern. That's another story. But I ended up teaching deaf kids for about 8 years. I burned out, too frustrating. And then about 8 years later, I went back to Northeastern University in Boston, and I learned ASL more from deaf people. And I trained to become an interpreter. I did it for a couple of years. I burned out again. So I haven't really worked with deaf people for about 20 years, but I've just always, my uncle has always been there in the background, even though he passed away many years ago. And I ended up writing this book about it. Well, also, around the time I started the book was around the time I turned 50. I woke up one morning and I noticed that I couldn't hear out of my left ear, basically. And the hearing never came back. In fact, it got worse. So I'm hard of hearing. I have one ear that's pretty good and one ear that is almost worthless. And that happened just kind of, I'm still not sure why. I've been to a few doctors and they have theories, but it was one of those things that just happened, and was another one of those resonances between my uncle's life and my life, which have been kind of playing out throughout my life. So yeah, there's a lot of ironic stuff and connections between him and me. And I actually added a piece to the show, which is not in this version, which is more about my uncle and the connection between us. It's in my book, and it was from my first show, and I incorporated it into this show. And one of the things I'm also planning to do as I tweak the show is to bring in a little more American Sign Language into it. That was something my director suggested, because I have it in like a few little spots in the show, but she said, she wanted to see it as more of a connection through the show, because that thing about hearing and hearing loss, and, in my case, I think it's kind of connected to aging, but it's also connected to difference and otherness and identity, and my uncle and me and my uncle, and it goes deep for me. So but yeah, it did, like when I lost my hearing, I was like, wow, another connection, not something I would have chosen. That also became the impetus for me to finally write that book, which took me 10 years to finish. And it's not a very big book, but it was hard to write.
That's amazing, and I love. I never really considered that, but like the idea that the gay community, the idea of being gay and being deaf, of building a community around you of people of similar nature, gives you something that you can't necessarily have with family because they can't relate as well. That is so amazing, and it's really kind of a fantastic thing. You talk about your age throughout the whole thing and how you've kind of come late into the performance, but it is one of those things, as like artists, it's kind of like when we start to fall apart is kind of when we start to shine as artists, which is a very well, it can be taken as a dark thing or as kind of a beautiful thing, but I think that kind of resonates with what you've done with the show. And um, I honestly, I hope we get to see you live in person, and see some of these new things you've added to the show, because it sounds amazing. Um, if you haven't seen his show yet, if you haven't seen Judah's show yet, please watch it. It's only $5 to watch his show, from now until August or October 4th. Judah, do you have anywhere people can follow you on social media or online anywhere?
Yeah, so I have a website which really needs some updating, but there's some samples of my work and some of my writing. So there's some video and some writing there. It's just my name, judaleblang.com. So JUDAHLEBLANG.com. And also if anybody's interested in my book, which is called Echoes of Jerry, which was published last fall, they can also get it through my website. It's also on Amazon. Again, it's just called Echoes of Jerry. It's a paperback, and it's a quick read. But it wasn't a quick write for me there. But I feel like there's a lot of heart in it. The people I know who have read it, I think they seem to take away from it. They seem to be affected by it. It's really hard to share a book or to sell a book in a pandemic. I came out last fall and I had a number of readings, including a few for the deaf community, that all were canceled because they were scheduled for March, April, May, and hopefully some of those I'll be able to reschedule at some point. But it's really tough, with books, a lot of bookstores being closed and everything. But yeah, like I feel like the people who have gotten the book seem to really find it to be an interesting. I think it's an unusual story, but I think that anybody who's ever felt different or like an outsider, I think there's definitely, like stuff that people would relate to around that, feeling different. And then the idea of trying to like find our voice, and certainly anybody who's doing something creative. For me, that's maybe the positive thing toward the end of the book. The fact that, finally, like in my 40s, that's really when I started to become a writer, and really wasn't until my 50s that I finally got up the nerve to do the performance stuff. So it took me a long time, but I believe that we all have that ability to like reinvent ourselves or try something new. And we can use I mentioned getting older as like a series, in some ways, a series of losses. But when I was going through all this stuff, like when I lost my hearing and I had kidney stones and all these things happened when I was like 49, turning 50. And one of my friends said, well, you're a writer, it's all material, so, obviously it wasn't material I would have chosen, but it's true. And I mean, again, that was kind of what finally pushed me to write the book, was because after losing my hearing, I was like, okay, well, this is just another one of many connections or many weird coincidences between me and Jerry. And this is a story I need to tell, so, and the show, there's a piece of that in the show. So anyway, yeah, I'd love to be able to do it in Elgin. I was going to also try to set up like a bookstore reading or something, in Chicago or somewhere, in the north, somewhere around Chicagoland, because while I was coming in, I figured I would try to double dip. But I don't know, maybe hopefully next year.
Hopefully, yeah. I mean, I know personally, I'd like to see, like I said, I'd like to see your show in person. And I think many of our viewers probably would as well. So I want to thank you for joining me today. It's been great to talk to you.
Same here.
Like I said, if you haven't seen his show, Judah LeBlang's, it's Now or Never, available through October 4th for $5. If you want to see all the shows in the festival, it's only $50 to see all the shows. So please feel free to do that. And that money goes right back to the artist. It goes right back to them. So please do that. Please check out their work. It's fantastic. It's amazing. And it is so human, all of it across the board. I want to thank you all for watching today and watching all of these interviews, whether you're watching them live or later on. It's greatly appreciated. And I want you to know that our next interview is tomorrow at 7:30 with Mike Speller. So please join us again then. Once again, thank you to Judah and thank you to you. We'll be back tomorrow.